Everyone laughed at the elderly woman and her mud house. In winter, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees. When the village began to freeze, it became clear who was wrong. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The winter did not announce itself with snow at first. It came the way it often did on the frontier, quietly and without mercy, slipping into the ground long before it showed itself in the sky. By late October, the soil around the settlement had already stiffened, no longer yielding easily under boots or hooves. Each morning carried a sharper edge than the last, and the wind, which never truly left this place, had begun to linger longer in the valleys, pressing itself into cracks, seams, and lungs alike. The settlement lay exposed, a scatter of cabins set too far apart for comfort and too close together for pride. Men had built them as they had always built them, square and upright, with tall walls and roofs pitched high to shed snow that had not yet come. They stood like defiance made of wood, each one daring the land to test it. And the land always accepted that challenge. People moved faster now, heads lowered, shoulders hunched against a cold that had not yet turned cruel, but promised it would. Roof seams were patched, chimneys reinforced, doors rehung. Axes rang from dawn to dusk as men hurried to stockpile firewood, each believing that more logs meant more safety. Smoke rose thick and anxious from chimneys, carried sideways by the wind, torn apart before it could climb. Even the animals felt it. Horses stamped and snorted in their pens, cattle pressed together at night, chickens roosted lower than usual, feathers puffed tight against their bodies. At the edge of the settlement, where the ground dipped and the wind found no barrier before racing down from the open hills, stood the house of the old woman and her son. It had been there longer than most, and it showed. The boards were warped, the chinking cracked and fallen away in places. When the wind blew from the east, it slipped through the walls as though the house were breathing, a slow, cold breath that never quite stopped. Inside, the air was always moving. You could feel it along your ankles even when you stood still. At night, it crept beneath blankets and into bones, and by morning, the water bucket near the door wore a skin of ice thick enough to break with a knuckle. The son had learned to wake before dawn, feed the stove, then crawl back into bed for an hour of half sleep before the cold returned. He was a man of 40, though the years had worked on him harder than that number suggested. His hands were strong, scarred, and stiff from labor, but they shook sometimes in the early mornings, not from weakness, but from the long familiarity of cold. He had never married. There had been a woman once, years back, but winter had taken her mother, then her father, and then the woman herself had left, choosing a place farther south where the ground did not freeze so deeply and the wind did not speak so loudly. Since then, his life had settled into a pattern of work, sleep, and endurance. It was not a bad life, he told himself. It was simply the one he knew. His mother lived with him still, small and spare as a bundled branch. Her hair had gone fully white years ago, and her back curved not from weakness, but from habit, the long memory of bending to earth and fire. She spoke little, and when she did, her words came measured and calm, as though she had learned long ago that most things worth saying did not need repeating. She had lived in this place before the settlement had a name. She had watched cabins rise and fall, families come and leave, winters take what they pleased and give nothing back. She had buried a husband, 2 friends, and more neighbors than she cared to count. She did not talk about those losses, but they lived in her eyes, which never rushed and never wandered far from what was real. On the morning when the ground finally rang hard beneath the sun's boots, she stood by the door, watching the wind worry the tall grass beyond the cabin. The sky was pale, stretched thin, and the air smelled of iron and frost. The son pulled his coat tighter, already thinking about how many more days he could delay before adding another layer to the walls or fetching more wood from the far stand of trees. "We won't fix this house," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He stopped, one hand on the doorframe. He had not been thinking of leaving, not truly, but the words struck him like a sudden gust. He turned to look at her, searching her face for some sign of uncertainty, but there was none. "What do you mean we won't?" he asked. "It needs fixing every year. You know that." She nodded once, as if agreeing with him. "That's why." The wind pushed harder against the door, rattling it in its frame. The son frowned. He had learned over years to listen when his mother spoke, but this felt different. There was a finality in her tone that unsettled him. "We'll build something else," she continued. "Not here." He laughed once, short and uneasy. "Where then?" "There's no better ground. Everyone knows that." She stepped past him and pointed, not toward the open valley, but toward the darker line of trees that bordered the land beyond the cabins. It was a stand of mixed growth, older than the settlement itself, where trunks grew close together and the underbrush tangled thick and low. Most people avoided it. The ground there was uneven, roots breaking through the soil like knuckles, and the shade lingered long after the sun had risen elsewhere. "Between the trees," she said. He stared at her, then followed her gaze. The idea seemed absurd. You did not build among trees unless you wanted rot, damp, insects, and darkness. You built in the open, where the sun could reach you and the wind could carry smoke away. That was how it had always been done. "That's madness," he said, more sharply than he intended. "No one builds there." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her eyes made him quiet. "No one listens there either," she replied. They stood in silence for a long moment. The wind eased, just slightly, as if pausing to hear what would be said next. "You want to cut trees?" he asked finally. "Haul logs through that mess? It would take weeks." She shook her head. "We won't cut them. They've stood longer than us." "Then what?" he demanded. "Mud. That's not a house. That's a wall waiting to fall." "Earth holds heat," she said simply, "and straw holds earth. Trees hold wind." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was no anger in her, no excitement, only certainty. That frightened him more than if she had been raving. All that day, as he worked and hauled and repaired what he could, her words followed him. Earth holds heat. Trees hold wind. He watched the smoke from neighboring cabins tear itself apart in the air. He watched the wind slip unbroken across the open ground, gathering speed before it slammed into walls and roofs. He watched a man across the way struggle to rehang a door that would not stay shut, the hinges already warped by cold. That night, the wind rose higher than it had yet that season. The stove burned hot, but the warmth did not last. By midnight, the cold had crept back in, settling into the corners, pressing against his ribs as he lay awake. His mother slept on, breathing slow and even, wrapped in quilts she had stitched herself decades ago. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the house complain, every board speaking its own language of strain. For the first time, he did not feel anger at it. He felt tired, bone tired, tired of fighting something that never tired back. By morning, his decision wasn't made, but his resistance had weakened. He said nothing as they ate their thin breakfast. When she rose and pulled on her boots, he followed her outside without comment. They walked slowly toward the trees. With each step, the wind softened. By the time they reached the first line of trunks, it had dropped to a murmur, broken and confused. The old woman stopped and pressed her palm against the bark of a leaning tree, feeling the cold surface beneath her skin. "Here," she said. He looked around. The ground dipped slightly, sheltered on 3 sides by thicker growth. Snow from an early flurry still lingered there, packed and unmoved. The air felt different. Still. He exhaled, long and slow. Somewhere deep in him, something loosened. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He simply stood there, listening, as the wind passed around them and went on its way. And that was how it began. They returned to the trees the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the low ridge to the east. Frost lay thick on the open ground, whitening the grass and stiffening every step. But beneath the first line of trunks, the earth was darker, softer, holding a damp chill instead of a biting one. The son noticed it at once, though he said nothing. His mother moved ahead of him slowly, her steps careful, as if she were listening through her feet. She made him walk the grove again and again, not in a straight line, but in loose circles, stopping often, sometimes for no reason he could see. She would crouch, scoop a handful of soil, rub it between her fingers, then let it fall. She would tilt her head, eyes half closed, as the wind threaded its way through the branches above. Where it sighed, she lingered. Where it rushed, she moved on. "This is foolish," he muttered once, more to himself than to her. "We know where we're building." She did not answer. She only kept walking. By midday, his boots were caked with mud, his legs aching from the uneven ground. He was ready to declare the whole thing finished, to pick a spot simply to be done with it. That was when she stopped for good. It wasn't the deepest part of the grove, nor the darkest. The trees there leaned inward, not tightly, but enough to create a natural bowl. 2 thick trunks bent toward each other like tired men sharing a burden, their roots lifting the ground into a shallow rise behind them. The land sloped gently downward in front, and when the wind reached that place, it faltered, split, and lost its shape. She stood there a long while, saying nothing. Then she nodded once. "Here," she said again, as she had the day before, but this time the words settled between them like a stone set in place. He looked around, really looked, and tried to imagine a house there. He failed. All he saw were roots, uneven earth, and shadow. There was no straight edge to measure from, no clear boundary. Everything felt wrong to him, and yet his chest no longer tightened the way it had when he thought of staying where they were. They began with digging, not building. That alone felt like an admission of defeat to him, as though they were making a grave instead of a home. He sank his shovel into the earth and worked until his shoulders burned, carving out a shallow hollow between the roots. The soil came up heavy and dark, rich with decay and the smell of old leaves. His mother sorted it, setting aside stones, pulling out tangled roots with care so as not to tear more than necessary. They did not clear the space entirely. She stopped him whenever he swung too wide, whenever he tried to make the edges straight. "Let it be," she said. "The land already knows its shape." When the hollow was deep enough, they began to mix the walls. She showed him how to tear the old straw she had saved into rough lengths, how to blend it with mud until it clung together without dripping. It was slow work, messier than any log building he had known. Mud caked his hands, crept under his nails, stained his clothes until he looked more like a creature risen from the ground than a man shaping it. The first wall rose not as a wall at all, but as a thick curve pressed against the earth itself. They packed it carefully, layer by layer, pushing it into the spaces between roots rather than fighting them. Where a root arched outward, the wall followed. Where the ground rose, the wall dipped. Nothing was square. Nothing was even. He argued once, his patience finally fraying. It won't stand like this. There's no frame." She wiped her hands on her skirt and looked at him. "It's standing already," she said. "You're just helping it decide where." That night, they returned to their old house, exhausted and silent. The son lay awake again, his muscles aching, his mind replaying the shape of the place they had begun. He dreamed of walls that bent and breathed, of a house that did not end where it should. The next day, the laughter began. A man from the settlement had seen them hauling straw toward the trees. He stopped to watch, leaning on his axe, a grin spreading across his face. By evening, the story had traveled faster than the wind. People gathered at a distance, calling out questions that were not questions at all. "You digging in already?" someone shouted. "Planning to bury yourselves before winter does it for you?" Another voice followed. "That's no house, that's a pig wall." The son kept his head down, his jaw clenched. Every word struck him like a blow, not because he believed them, but because he feared they might be right. He worked harder, shoveling, packing, lifting, until his arms trembled. His mother did not react. She did not even look up. She worked as she always had, steady and deliberate, as if the voices belonged to another world that did not touch her. As the walls grew, the shape of the place became clearer, though still strange. They raised them thick, far thicker than any wooden wall, leaning them slightly inward, so they would hold themselves. The entrance remained low and narrow, barely wide enough to pass through without turning sideways. "Why so small?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Big doors let big cold in," she replied. When the walls reached waist height, they began to layer more straw, more earth, building upward and inward at the same time. For the roof, she refused any heavy timber. Instead, they laid branches across the span, not straight, but overlapping, woven together like ribs. Over that, they packed more earth, sealing it tight, leaving only a small opening where a stovepipe might one day breathe. It was then that the woman from the settlement came. She arrived quietly, standing at the edge of the grove with a bundle in her arms. She did not laugh. She did not call out. She waited until the son noticed her and approached. "I brought bread," she said, holding it out, "and some dried meat." He hesitated, shame rising in his throat, but she only smiled, small and tired. "You'll need it," she added. "Whatever you're doing here, it's hard work." They sat together on a fallen log while his mother continued packing earth, unbothered. The woman asked no questions, only watched, her eyes following the curve of the walls, the way the trees leaned close. "It's quieter here," she said at last. He nodded. He had not realized how much that mattered until she said it. She came again 2 days later, and then again after that. Sometimes she stayed only long enough to leave food. Sometimes she lingered, speaking softly, asking about the work. Her presence eased something in him he had not known was tight. The settlement's laughter grew louder as the house took shape. People came just to see it, shaking their heads, placing bets on how long it would last. Children threw clods of dirt at the walls when they thought no one was watching. The son wanted to shout at them, to defend the work, to explain. His mother stopped him with a glance. "Let winter answer," she said. By the time the first heavy frost settled in earnest, the house stood finished. It crouched between the trees, like something born there, its walls dark and smooth, its roof barely rising above the ground. From a distance, it was almost invisible, a shadow among shadows. The son stood back and looked at it, his heart pounding. He could not tell if he felt pride or fear. Perhaps both. The wind rose that night, as if summoned. It tore through the open ground, rattling shutters, ripping loose boards from poorly fastened roofs. In the grove, it softened, broke, slipped past without finding a face to strike. They lit a small fire inside the new house, the flame low and cautious. The walls absorbed the heat, holding it close. The air did not rush. It waited. Outside, the settlement mocked and shivered. Inside, the house listened. The first true storm came without ceremony, as though the land had merely grown tired of waiting. The sky lowered itself over the valley, dull and heavy, and by late afternoon, the wind arrived in force, not in bursts, but in a steady, grinding push that did not ease when night fell. It pressed against the settlement with intent, probing every wall and roof, searching for weakness the way water searches for cracks in stone. In the open ground, the cabins answered at once. Boards creaked and popped. Chimneys moaned as air reversed itself inside them, dragging smoke back down into rooms where children slept. Doors rattled in their frames, hinges screaming until someone wedged a chair beneath the handle or drove a nail where it did not belong. Men fed their stoves until the iron glowed red, then fed them again, believing heat could be forced into obedience if only enough wood was burned. In the grove, the wind changed its voice. It did not stop, not entirely, but it lost its edge. It split and curved around the trees, confused by trunks that did not yield and roots that refused to let the earth lift. By the time it reached the low, rounded shape of the new house, it had forgotten how to strike. It slid over the packed roof, slipped along the walls, and went on its way without a sound worth naming. Inside, the son sat near the small stove pit, his hands wrapped around a tin cup. The fire burned low, no more than a steady orange breath, but the air around him did not thin or flee. The warmth stayed. It did not rush upward or leak outward. It settled, slow and patient, into the thick walls and the packed floor beneath his feet. His mother sat across from him, mending a tear in an old quilt by the firelight. Her movements were unhurried, precise. She did not look up when the wind rose higher outside. She had already listened to it all her life. He waited for the cold to come. He had learned to expect it, the moment when heat always surrendered. But it didn't arrive. The temperature inside the house held, neither warm nor bitter, simply steady. He took off his gloves, then his coat. His breath did not fog the air, as it would have in the old house. The walls did not whisper. The floor did not bite. For the first time since he could remember, he slept through the night without waking to feed the fire. By morning, the valley looked wounded. Snow had not yet fallen in earnest, but frost coated every surface, thick and sharp. Smoke rose from the settlement in frantic bursts, torn sideways before it could climb. A roof had partially collapsed 2 cabins down, its owner standing in the yard with his hands on his head, staring as if the damage might explain itself if given time. The son stepped out of the grove and felt the difference immediately. The wind struck him full in the chest, hard enough to steal his breath. He turned back and looked at the trees, at the shadowed space where the house crouched unseen. He had not realized how completely it had sheltered him until he left it. That day, the laughter stopped. It did not vanish all at once. There were still glances, muttered comments, men shaking their heads as they passed the grove. But there was no longer certainty in them, no confidence, only curiosity, and something close to unease. The storms continued. They came in waves, each one harsher than the last. Snow finally fell, heavy and wet at first, then dry and cutting. It piled against cabin walls, crept under doors, sealed windows from the outside. Inside those square houses, the cold found every corner. People burned furniture, then crates, then anything that would catch. Some sealed their chimneys too tightly and filled their rooms with smoke. Others left them open and watched their heat vanish into the sky. In the grove, snow gathered too, but it behaved differently. It settled thick against the walls of the low house, pressing close like another layer of insulation. The roof sagged slightly under its weight, but the woven branches held, flexing instead of snapping. Inside, the air grew warmer, not hotter, just more secure, as if the world had wrapped itself tighter around them. The son began to understand what his mother had known all along. Heat was not something you created and defended. It was something you invited and then protected from escape. Their fire did not roar. It breathed. It did not fight the cold. It waited it out. Word spread quickly once fear replaced mockery. People began to drift toward the grove, at first pretending they were merely passing through, then stopping outright. They stood at the edge of the trees, stamping their feet, staring at the low shape half hidden in shadow. One evening, a man approached openly, his hat in his hands. He did not speak at first. He only looked at the walls, pressed a gloved hand against them, then withdrew it quickly, eyes widening. "It's warm," he said, not as a question, but as an admission. The son did not answer. He had learned from his mother that explanations offered too early were wasted. As the weeks passed, the woman from the settlement came more often. At first she brought food, then she stayed longer. When the cold grew especially fierce, she remained through the night, sleeping near the wall, wrapped in her own blanket. No one commented on it. In winter, survival made its own allowances. She helped tend the fire, learned how little wood it needed, how slowly it should burn. She marveled at the silence, at how the wind could scream beyond the trees and yet not reach them. Sometimes she cried without sound, and the son understood it was not only from fear of the cold, but from relief. In the settlement, things grew worse. Frostbite took fingers and toes. A child fell ill and did not recover. The sound of coughing carried through the night, sharp and hollow. People began to move with a different urgency, no longer trying to prove their strength, but simply trying to endure. One night, as the storm howled louder than it had yet, the son woke to find his mother sitting upright, listening. He felt a flicker of fear then, sharp and sudden. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing new," she said. "Just old sounds." By morning, the wind had done its work. A fence lay flattened. A roof lay scattered across the snow like broken ribs. The settlement looked smaller, diminished. And still, the house in the grove stood. That was when people stopped laughing altogether. They did not praise the house. They did not call it clever or inspired. They simply acknowledged it. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted. The son watched this change with a quiet astonishment. He had lived his life braced against judgment, expecting it, enduring it. Now he saw men who had once scoffed lower their eyes when they passed him. He felt no triumph in it, only a deep, steady understanding that the world did not bend for pride. As winter deepened, his mother's strength began to wane. It was subtle at first. She rested more between tasks. Her steps slowed. She slept longer in the mornings, her breathing shallow but calm. She did not complain, did not name it. But the son noticed, and fear settled in his chest, heavier than the cold ever had. The woman from the settlement noticed too. She took on more of the work without being asked, her presence becoming a constant rather than a comfort borrowed when needed. Together, she and the son watched over the old woman, kept the fire steady, the walls intact. One evening, as the storm eased, and the sky cleared just enough to show a scatter of stars, the son stepped outside and looked back toward the settlement. Lights flickered weakly in a handful of cabins. Smoke rose in broken lines. He turned and looked at the grove, at the dark, sheltering shapes of the trees, at the house that did not want to be seen. For the first time, he understood that winter had not been defeated. It had simply been refused permission to enter. And in that refusal, something else had been born. Winter did not loosen its grip quickly. It rarely did in this place. Even after the worst storms had passed, the cold lingered like a memory that refused to fade, settling into the earth and bones alike. Days grew marginally brighter, but the sun brought little warmth, only a pale light that revealed the damage left behind. The settlement bore its scars openly. Roofs sagged or lay collapsed entirely. Chimneys leaned at uncertain angles, their mortar split and crumbled by repeated freezing. Fences had vanished beneath drifts or been torn apart and scattered across the frozen ground. In the grove, the house remained unchanged. Snow still clung thick against its curved walls, packed tight, unmoving. Inside, the air held steady, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply livable. The fire burned low and patient, just as it always had. The sun moved through the space quietly now, his steps careful, his attention fixed not on the walls or the roof, but on the small figure resting near the rear of the house. His mother lay bundled in quilts, her face pale but peaceful. Her eyes were often closed now, her breathing shallow but even. When she woke, it was for short stretches. She would watch the fire, listen to the faint sounds of the grove, then drift back into sleep without speaking. There was no fear in her. If she felt pain, she did not show it. If she knew what was coming, she did not name it. The son sat with her whenever he could, holding her hand, feeling the thin warmth of her skin. He wanted to ask questions he had never asked before, wanted to hear stories he had never demanded. But each time he opened his mouth, the words felt wrong, too heavy, too late. She had taught him everything she intended to through action, not explanation. Now she seemed content to let silence finish the work. The woman from the settlement stayed with them constantly. She moved with a quiet confidence, tending the fire, bringing water, preparing what little food they had left. There was no awkwardness between her and the son anymore. The closeness that had grown through shared winter nights no longer needed caution. It was simply there, steady and unspoken. Outside, people began to gather their strength again. The storms eased, leaving behind a cold that no longer attacked, but lingered. Those who could ventured out to repair what they could, salvaging boards, propping walls, patching roofs in ways that looked more desperate than hopeful. Some came to the grove, not to stare now, but to stand quietly among the trees, breathing the still air as though it might teach them something if they listened long enough. No one asked the old woman for explanations. They had learned better than that. They watched instead. They observed how the house held the cold at bay without fighting it, how the snow itself became part of the shelter rather than an enemy to be cleared away. A few began to talk of building differently when spring came, though none yet knew exactly how. The old woman did not live to see those changes. She passed in the early hours of a morning so quiet it felt unreal. The wind had fallen entirely, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The son woke with a start, sensing the absence before he understood it. He reached for her hand and found it cool, still resting where it had been the night before. Her face was calm, her mouth relaxed, as if she had simply finished a long task and laid herself down to rest. He did not cry at first. He sat with her, his hand still wrapped around hers, his mind strangely empty. When the woman touched his shoulder, gently, he nodded once and rose. Together, they prepared her body as best they could, wrapping her in quilts and hides, working slowly, reverently. Word traveled through the settlement before the sun fully rose. People came without being asked, moving quietly through the grove, removing their hats, their voices hushed. There was no ceremony planned, no words prepared. None were needed. They buried her near the house, between the trees that had sheltered her final work. The ground was hard, but not unyielding. The son dug until his arms ached, then dug more, driven by a need he could not name. When they lowered her into the earth, he felt no anger, no injustice, only a deep, aching gratitude that she had endured long enough to show him how. The woman from the settlement stood beside him, her hand steady on his arm. When the earth was finally replaced and the last stone set in place, the grove returned to its quiet, unchanged by grief, but holding it all the same. Spring came slowly, but it came. The thaw began in fits and starts. Snow softened, then refroze, then softened again. Water ran in thin lines across the ground, tracing paths that had been hidden all winter. The son noticed how the land around the house released its grip differently, how the earth beneath remained firm while the open ground turned to mud. He remembered his mother's words and understood them more fully now. As the days lengthened, the settlement began to rebuild. But it didn't rebuild as it had before. People worked lower to the ground. They studied the wind. They dug before they raised walls. Some came to the grove to ask quiet questions, not of the sun directly, but of the space itself. He answered when he could, showing rather than telling, letting them see how the walls curved, how the roof bent, how the fire lived deep within the earth instead of standing apart from it. The woman stayed. What had begun as kindness hardened into commitment. She and the son worked side by side as spring turned the ground soft and workable. They expanded the house slightly, not upward, but outward, deepening the walls, reinforcing the roof with more woven branches and earth. The structure remained humble, nearly invisible from a distance, but stronger than it had been before. They married in the late summer, quietly, without ceremony beyond what the settlement itself provided. There was food, shared and simple. There was laughter, subdued but real. There were no speeches. Everyone understood what had brought them together. Years passed. The winters continued to come, some harsh, some merely difficult. The house endured them all. The son grew older, his hair touched with gray, his hands still strong, but slower. The woman remained steady at his side, her presence a constant warmth that did not need naming. The settlement changed around them. New houses rose that did not challenge the land, but rested within it. Curved walls, lower roofs, thicker earth. The grove became a place of learning rather than mockery. Children grew up knowing that shelter did not need to be loud to be strong. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, the son would sit by the fire and think of his mother. He would remember her hands in the earth, her quiet certainty, the way she had trusted the land to hold them if they would only listen. He did not speak her name aloud often. He did not need to. Every wall, every winter survived, carried her memory forward. The house remained what it had always been, not a monument, not a triumph, a listening place. And that was enough. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More stories like this are already waiting for you here. Share this video with someone who values quiet strength and real survival. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from.